in session. This meeting is necessary for the council to continue operations of the city and the discharge of its lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities, and is being conducted and held pursuant to and compliance with City of Norfolk Ordinance 48061 as authorized by Virginia Code Section 15.2, 1413, and will be conducted telephonically and electronically. Notice of this meeting was given to the public on July the 10th, 2020 in the Virginian Pilot. An electronic copy of the agenda was posted on the city's website July 10th, 2020. Please stand for a moment of silence and remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mrs. Doyle.
Here.
Mrs. Graves.
Here.
Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson.
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. McClellan.
Here.
Mr. Riddick.
Here.
Mr. Smeagol.
Here.
Mr. Thomas.
Here.
Dr. Alexander.
Here, the motion is to dispense with the reading of the minutes of our previous meeting.
Mrs. Doyle.
Aye.
Mrs. Graves.
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson.
I said aye.
Thank you. Mrs. McClellan.
Aye.
Mr. Riddick.
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol.
Aye.
Mr. Thomas.
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. Mr. Clerk, please read the resolution certifying a closed meeting.
I have a resolution certifying a closed meeting of the Council of the City of Norfolk in accordance with the provisions of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. Adopt the resolution. Mrs. Doyle.
Aye.
Mrs. Graves.
Before I vote, I just want to say, I just posted on my social media page about our delay in our council meeting coming from closed session to open session. And so we need to make sure that if we have this kind of delay again, that somebody from communications is sharing a screen or something to let people know that the council members will be in session shortly, so that people know that, you know, we're coming or whatever, and we don't just leave folks hanging. I vote aye.
Thank you. Mrs. Johnson.
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan.
Aye.
Mr. Riddick.
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol.
Aye.
Mr. Thomas.
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. Tonight, we will first take up public hearings, then the consent agenda, which will be voted on in a block. If any member of the council or the public wishes to discuss an item, it will be removed from the consent agenda and considered separately. Following the consent agenda, we will take up regular agenda items in the order as they appear on the docket. There's no new business to address the council. You should have registered to speak before 6 p.m. with the clerk. Mr. Clerk,
Certainly, sir.
PH1.
Public hearing one scheduled this day pursuant to state law on the application of City Planning Commission for a text amendment to the Norfolk zoning ordinance to allow health and fitness facility by conditional use permit in the West Freemason Historic and Cultural Conservation District.
Mr. Clerk, call the roll.
I have an ordinance to amend table 3.6.11 of the Norfolk zoning ordinance so as to add health and fitness facility as a permitted use by conditional use permit only in the West Freemason Historic and Cultural Conservation District. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle.
Aye.
Mrs. Graves.
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson.
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan.
Aye.
Mr. Riddick.
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol.
Aye.
Mr. Thomas. Dr. Alexander.
Aye. PH2.
Public hearing two scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments authorizing the conveyance to Kelowna Shipyard of a certain strip of property numbered as 327 South Main Street for the total sum of $900 in accordance with the terms and conditions in the purchase and sale agreement.
Before we vote, wait, do we have where is this property?
Same thing.
Yeah, is it a house or is it a terminus where is it a dead end? Do we know, Bernard?
Yes, it's like a fragment. It's appraising at $900. It's pretty small.
Can I
It's
ask to hold this one up?
325 South Main Street.
327?
Let me see, beginning at the northwest.
Mr. Reader wants to continue, motion is to
Yeah.
continue?
August 25th.
Motion is to continue, Mr. Clerk, call the roll.
Mrs. Doyle?
We're voting to continue, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, to August 25th.
Aye.
Thank you. Mrs. Graves? Is that an aye? Mrs. Graves?
She said aye.
Oh, sh-
Aye.
Mrs.
Sorry.
Johnson?
Aye.
Thank you. Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye. PH 3,
Public hearing 3 scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments authorizing the conveyance to Lundy Real Estate LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 1515 Canoga Street in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. I have an ordinance authorizing the conveyance to Lundy Real Estate LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 1515 Canoga Street in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
aye. PH 4,
Public hearing 4 scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 712 B Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. I have an ordinance authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 712 B Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Abstain.
Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
aye. PH 5,
Public hearing 5 scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 746 A Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. I have an ordinance authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 746 A Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Abstain.
And for the record, Mrs. Graves, your abstention for this and the previous one is that your business relationship with GPMC gives you a personal interest?
That is correct.
Thank you.
As well as PH 6 and 7. Yeah.
Thank you. Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
aye. PH 6,
Public hearing 6 scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 771 A Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. I have an ordinance authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located at 771 A Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle
Aye.
and Mrs. Graves.
Abstain.
Thank you. Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smigiel,
Aye.
thank you. Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. PH 7.
Public hearing 7 scheduled this date pursuant to state law to hear comments authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located on south side of B Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of a certain condition. I have an ordinance authorizing the conveyance to GPMC Properties LLC of that certain parcel of property located south side of B Avenue in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase and sale agreement and authorizing the release of the city's right of reverter upon satisfaction of certain condition. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Abstain.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick.
Ms. Graves, are all of these gym lots where we're gonna have homes built?
That's the idea.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I just wanna make sure that a lot of people are investing in these gym lots. So the support that we need to give, whether it's, preparing the streets, curbs, sidewalks, gutter, traffic. If people are going to invest in about 6 or 7 homes to be built, then the city has to do its duty to make sure that we're supporting these purchases. And I vote aye.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Smigiel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye.
Mr. Riddick, can I just say,
Ms.
there are a
Graves?
lot of
Ms. Graves?
builders and
Ms. Graves?
realtors that are out there in the Huntersville community, and I think that whatever the long-term plan is, it would be very beneficial for them to be able to know that with regard to that support, because it could definitely be a selling point for anyone who is currently building
Ms. Graves?
and who's going to be building
Ms.
to
Graves?
know what that may look like.
Too late, Ken. I was trying to stop her. All right, thank you. PH 8.
Public hearing 8 scheduled this date pursuant to state law to hear comments approving the terms and conditions of a lease with Norfolk Fest Events Ltd. for certain premises located at 120 West Main Street, Norfolk, Virginia, and authorizing the execution of the lease. I have an ordinance approving the terms and conditions of a lease with Norfolk Fest Events Ltd. for certain premises located at 120 West Main Street, Norfolk, Virginia, and authorizing the execution of the lease. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smigiel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. PH 9.
Public hearing 9 scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments approving the terms and conditions of a lease with Norfolk Fest Events Ltd. for the certain premises located at 123 Granby Street, Norfolk, Virginia, and authorizing the execution of the lease. I have an ordinance approving the terms and conditions of a lease with Norfolk Fest Events Ltd. for certain premises located at 123 Granby Street, Norfolk, Virginia, and authorizing the execution of the lease. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smigiel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. PH 10.
Public hearing 10 scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments approving a lease agreement between Salon Celluel LLC and the lease of city-owned property located at 236 East Main Street. I have an ordinance approving a lease agreement with Salon Celluel LLC for the lease of city-owned property located at 236 East Main Street. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smigiel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. PH 11.
Public hearing 11 scheduled this day pursuant to state law to hear comments authorizing the conveyance to Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority of those certain parcels of property being portions of Jolly Roger Way and Nansman Bay Street that have been recently closed, abandoned, and vacated. I have an ordinance authorizing the conveyance to Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority of those certain parcels of property being portions of Jolly Roger Way and Nansman Bay Street that have been recently closed, abandoned, and vacated. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye. Mr. Clerk, the consent agenda, C1 through C14 will be considered in the block unless otherwise noted.
Sir. Approve the consent agenda, dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinances twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye. R1,
R1 is an ordinance approving lease agreement with Old Dominion University for the lease of the parking lot located at the intersection of Hampton Boulevard and 50th Street. And this item was initially brought to you on June 9th for acceptance of bids for a 5-year parking lease at Hampton Boulevard and 50th Street. The matter was continued until tonight, July 14th, to allow for review and recommendation by the staff. After review and discussion with ODU, this matter is now coming to you with a recommendation for a 2-year lease for parking at Hampton Boulevard and 50th Street. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves? Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Thank you. Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel? Mr. Smiegel? He's spinning.
spinning. Should we maybe?
Just got Tommy's proxy.
Buffering.
Us.
Can we come back to him?
I mean, we can go back and lie.
Let's get him on the phone. He's buffing.
He's buffering. We're all gonna be buffering.
It's ringing now.
You have reached the voicemail box.
Maybe last one. Maybe last one. Where is it? Where did he can enter his vote in the record?
Yeah.
I can hear you guys.
Oh, okay.
Great.
That was an aye.
Thank you.
I think I have too many teenagers on the internet. It's my bandwidth.
Yeah.
Mr. Thomas.
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. R2.
R2 is an ordinance granting a conditional use permit to authorize the operation of a car wash named Green Clean Car Wash on property located at 7442 Tidewater Drive. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye. R3.
R3 is an ordinance amending section 32-22 of the Norfolk City Code 1979 so as to expand the number of seats on the City Planning Commission from 7 to 8. Dispense with.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes,
I've received some additional comments today on R3, and I'd respectfully request a continuance so I could look further into it, if that's okay.
so moved. Clerk, call the roll.
Continue to August 25th.
Yes.
Motion. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mrs. Riddick, Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye, R4.
R4 is an ordinance amending FY 21 annual appropriations ordinance number 47999, accepting, appropriating, and authorizing the expenditure of grant funds of up to the sum of $200,196 if and when received from the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, appropriating and authorizing the expenditure of a local cash match in the amount of $50,049 for the residential substance abuse treatment for prisoners with medication-assisted treatment program, including payment of the salaries and benefits for 2 sheriff-created positions and authorizing the city manager to take administrative action to accomplish said payments. Dispense with the charter requirement, reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
thank you, Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye, R5.
R5 is an ordinance amending the FY 2021 annual appropriations ordinance number 47999 so as to accept, appropriate, authorize the expenditure of grant funds up to the sum of $38,400 from the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services for the Addiction Recovery Program for the Norfolk Sheriff's Office. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye, R6.
R6 is an ordinance amending the FY 2020 annual appropriations ordinance number 47636 so as to accept, appropriate, and authorize the expenditure of grant funds up to the sum of $564,663 from the United States Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance Coronavirus Emergency Formula Funds for the preparation for, prevention, and response to the coronavirus pandemic for the Norfolk Police Department and Norfolk Sheriff's Office.
All right, Mr. Poole, Carl Poole.
Yes,
Yes, Mr. Poole, welcome to the city council meeting. You're in the council's meeting.
thank you. My name is Carl Poole. I live at 234 West 33rd Street in Norfolk, Virginia. I'll make my comments brief on this. When this agenda item popped up on there, it says for the preparation for prevention and response to the COVID epidemic. When you look at the ordinance, it's talking about supplies, equipment, training, and overtime. So unless Norfolk Police and the Norfolk Sheriffs have some very extraordinary abilities for contact tracing or for developing a vaccine, I'm not sure how this applies. So I know this is federal money, but unless you're putting matching funds to go into the rest of Norfolk's budget at a time when we're tight on money, I'm not seeing where this is going to be useful.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Clerk?
Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas, Dr.
Aye.
Alexander.
Aye. R7?
R7 is an ordinance to amend and reordain the Norfolk City Code 1979 as amended so as to amend sections 23-24 and 23-29 concerning the library board and the administration has asked that this item be continued to August 25th.
Motion is to continue at the request of the city manager to August 25th. Mr. Clerk, call the roll.
Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson? Mrs. Johnson? Thank you.
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
R8.
R8 is an ordinance authorizing the city manager to pay the salaries and benefits of 4 new sheriff-created deputy positions to provide security within the Commonwealth Courts of the city of Norfolk. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves? Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye. R9.
R9 is an ordinance to amend and reordain the Norfolk City Code 1979 as amended so as to add 1 new section concerning Deputy Chief of Police position. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye. R10.
R10 is a resolution in support of the application of the Virginia Department of Transportation, VDOT, for 5 projects for the fiscal year 2027 Smart Scale Program, and of the request for VDOT to fund the projects in the amount of $74,671,463. Adopt the resolution. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick.
Aye.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Smiegel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. R11.
R11 is a resolution approving the exercise by the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority of powers conferred by the Virginia Housing Authorities Law, Chapter 1, Title 36 of the Code of Virginia 1950 as amended in connection with the issuance of its multifamily housing revenue bonds in a principal amount of up to $14,500,000, with the proceeds of which will be loaned to Kojic Memorial Home for the Elderly Preservation LP to assist it in financing a portion of the cost of acquiring, renovating, and rehabilitating the Kojic high-rise apartments located at 2412 East Virginia Beach Boulevard, Norfolk, Virginia, and financing certain related costs and reserves, and upon which the city shall not have any payment obligation. Adopt the resolution. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
So does this mean that the Kojic High Rise is going to be an NRHA facility now?
Oh, no. This does not pertain to ownership at all. The borrower will get a lower interest rate through this endorsement.
Renovated.
Okay. I vote aye.
thank you. Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. R12.
R12 is a resolution approving applying for Port Host Communities Revitalization Grant Funds for the Willis Building at 645 Church Street project. Adopt the resolution. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. R13.
R13 is a resolution approving applying for industrial revitalization grant funds for the repurposing of Military Circle Mall project. Adopt the resolution. Mrs. Doyle,
Abstain.
thank you. Mrs. Graves,
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smiegel,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye. R14.
R14 is an ordinance appropriating and authorizing the expenditure of $2 million and authorizing a cooperation agreement between the City of Norfolk and the Economic Development Authority of the City of Norfolk for the purpose of administering grants to small for-profit businesses and nonprofit businesses physically located in the City of Norfolk and affected by COVID-19. Dispense with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson? Thank you. Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smigiel?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
R15.
R15 is an ordinance requiring the city manager to implement an evaluation of policing practices for the past 5 years and create a proposal for an oversight and review panel and increase funding for a full-time crisis response team.
Mr. Poole, carpool? Mr. Poole, welcome back to the
Yes,
City
sir.
Council.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, welcome back. You're in the council meeting.
Okay, thank you. This ordinance is, one, not well thought out, and in two, it should be three different ordinances, to be quite honest. And there's a lot more detail that needs to be worked out. For instance, sections 1 and sections 2 should be its own ordinance. And we should start talking not about limiting to the previous 5 years, but any and all use of force reports. And it shouldn't be just an option to send it to a third party so they can massage the numbers. Do that if you want to and spend what you want on that if you want to, but the information, the data, those reports should be released in the raw to the public immediately. That should be its own ordinance. Section 3, we're talking about oversight and review committee. Unless it's got teeth, unless you've got subpoena power involved in that, unless you have some real options in order for discipline for police officers, even as far as firing police officers or sheriffs, then it's about as useless as a committee that's in Virginia Beach and with all the problems they're having. It needs to be more thought and consider more than just a 5-year interval for evaluation. Section 4. Now, if we're talking about a special response team that's going to deal with nonviolent things that are happening in the city, then that's definitely something that needs to take more time in order for it to be thought out and broken down, regardless of what amount of money you're spending. If you see what's the sort of thing that's happening in St. Petersburg in Florida, by October 1st, they're talking about a separate response team that is just social workers. They're taking very serious steps in order to do this sort of thing. And this isn't a serious step here. This is like in response to perhaps people sitting on your front lawn about a week and a half ago. This ordinance in of itself needs to be more thought out, and you need to take more time with it.
Thank you. Okay. The next, this is Safali Hejde. Okay. Tyler Eldred. Hello, Mr. Eldred?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome to the City Council meeting. You're in the meeting.
Norfolk City Council, we know what's in the use of force records. Assault, like what happened to my friend Barrett Hicks, who was tackled, threatened, arrested, for no reason other than someone thought he matched the description, black man, white t-shirt. And death. Deaths like William James, like India Beatty, like Calvin White this past January, like Isaiah Swift last month, still recovering from a life-threatening shooting from this department. Was Isaiah Swift, who was running at the time, a violent threat? I think you know the answer, and so do we. There's more that I could list, and still more I cannot list because this police department is not upfront when it kills or beats someone, and it must be pieced together from news stories, firsthand accounts, or buried beliefs aggregate reports. And we know why these reports are not released. From Chicago to West Virginia to Alabama to Buffalo, we have seen that when there is a police killing, there is a police cover-up. And the good apples, the ones who speak up, get punished for it. Is the concern that releasing this report would injure trust with this community? Look around you. There is no trust, and not yet any trust earned. Neither do I have any interest in hearing proposals for more funding from a police department who at the same time won't tell us what is happening here, where it happened, who, what were their names, how long ago, and how much further from now until it ends. Thank you.
Thank you. Butch Bracknell. Hello, welcome to the City Council meeting. You're in the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and honorable councilpersons. My name is Robert Bracknell. I go by Butch. My address is 7118 Connecticut Avenue in Colonial Place, neighborhood of Norfolk, Virginia. I want to address a couple of things that I already sent in an email comment to the council that I hope was distributed about this public safety accountability body. I have a couple of points that I want to make here. Number one, this political accountability body has to be a political accountability connector between the police department, the citizens of Norfolk, and the council. And the board has to be accountable to council. That type of political accountability, council has to stay above that and has to set high-level policy for the city. And so what's missing in between the Norfolk Police Department's professional policing of itself by investigating itself and council at a very high strategic level is a board that can be the connecting file for political accountability between the police department, the citizens, and the council. Second, I agree with the prior speaker about real authority. A handful of things could be useful. Compulsory process. The city manager and the chief should have to respond to the board's findings in writing. Perhaps the ability to mandate certain actions. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this board should have the power to discipline officers directly, but that is something certainly we should look at. It should be able to influence the issue of whether the chief decides to discipline an officer. Finally, and verbatim transcripts, which should be publicly released as a matter of right, not as a result of Virginia FOIA, which can take forever to process. Number three, one thing that we've learned from the Virginia Beach example, they wrote it down in 1991 in their city council resolution. They didn't touch it again for 30 years. There need to be regular revisions and refinements to the policy based on what we learn over time about how to strengthen the board and to make it more functional. Fourth, it needs to get both citizen leaders and clergy as well as the police on board by design. One of the prior speakers said that the police department hasn't earned any respect or trust. I wouldn't go so far. They have a hard job, and the citizens, they have our gratitude for the difficult job that they do keeping us safe. Even so, they should not, they shouldn't be of a mindset to avoid accountability. And that's what this board is about. It isn't about headhunting. It isn't about covering for the police. It's providing accountability with fair processes that are both fair in actuality and fair in perception. They have to be fair in both design and execution. And finally, just one quick note on the issue of the raw data being released. I personally don't agree with that. I think the raw data in the hands of the public can be really, really dangerous. It needs to be aggregated. It needs to be analyzed. And that's one function that this board can do on behalf of the cities of Norfolk, is to make sense of the data. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tyler Grizzy.
Hello. Hello. Can you all hear me?
Yes, welcome to the council. You're in the meeting.
Hello. Thank you. Okay. Well, I would just like to start off by saying, in regards to the community review board, I do have some disagreements with the former speaker. I don't think the police should have a hand in the board. That, of course, is going to be a conflict of interest, just like the police union. They are going to do nothing but protect their own. We've seen it time and time again. No matter how many times police officers act out of line, the police union constantly protects rank and file officers, even if they know they did something wrong, and qualified immunity keeps them from having to deal with the consequences of their actions. That being said, we also should not be adding any money to the Norfolk Police Department's budget in order to fund this review board. They already have $77 million to spend. If they cannot make a community review board fit within those constraints, then they are not doing their job very well. Now, I would like to say, is Mr. Riddick present?
Yes.
Mr. Riddick, I would like to speak to you directly.
Sir,
You are.
Sir, you have to keep your comments to R15.
Okay, well, everyone may listen, but he is my representative. I am a citizen of Ward 4, and so.
Is your comments specific to to R15, to the issue at hand?
Okay, well, it is in review of that. I don't want any money added to it. All I can say is that as a former NAACP president, as somebody with 5 kids and 8 grandchildren, we've heard countless stories of how non-white people are treated in this country, and I don't want anyone else growing up in the future to have to deal with these stories as well and be terrorized by police officers. That is all.
Thank you so much. Anisha Shetty? Hello, welcome to the council meeting. You're in the meeting.
Hi, thank you, council members. I appreciate that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I appreciate that we're taking a step in the right direction in terms of additional transparency and being thoughtful about how we allocate resources and funding to truly ensure safer cities. But to avoid creating, I think the person who spoke before me, I think his name was Carl, to avoid creating toothless bodies and excessive spending, I think we really need to be vigilant and explicit about the details of this ordinance, which I don't really find that to be the case as it stands today. In terms of the use of force data, I would just like to advocate that it's the full use of force reports that are released in aggregate without filters, summaries, or expert analysis. We should ensure that the data that is being shared also allows it to be searched and organized by officers, race, gender, and disability status. And I see that there's a limit for 5 years, but I would encourage the board to change that to all existing historical use of force data, or at the very minimum 20 years of data, so that we will be able to do historical analysis. I see that there is also the ability for the public to access the data. I would encourage that again to be in the raw aggregate form, as well as any reports or analysis. I would also say that the police complaints should be released and published immediately, not annually, which could be construed from the way that the ordinance is currently written. In terms of the oversight and review panel, I echo somebody previously who said that there should not be police presence on the panel. It should be a purely civilian board and include marginalized groups. And they should have power to actually provide oversight and review. So that means subpoena power, the ability to decide consequences if appropriate. And if the officer is fired for excessive force, I would encourage the council to consider that the department should not rehire additional officers to replace. In terms of funding, I see that there's a $200,000 budget, which I think is great that we're willing to really invest in this initiative. It shows that the council, is trying to make this a priority. But I would encourage that a significant portion of that come from the existing Norfolk PD budget, and that any training recommendations that are come from the panel should also come from the existing Norfolk Police Department budget. There shouldn't be an expansion in that case. I would also say on the topic of transparency, it would be great to make accessible in public the 77 or 78 million budget, how it's used and supplemented, and also include the equipment and personnel allocations in the name of transparency. For the final piece of the ordinance.
Thank you very much. Your time has expired. Thank you so much for calling. Next, Jupiter.
Mr. Mayor, I've noticed that quite a few of the speakers are not stating their address before they speak, and it would be nice to know where they live.
Thank you.
And if they're Norfolk citizens.
Yes, thank you. Jupiter, you're in the council meeting. Please state your name and your home address.
She just left.
Jupiter left. All right, let's go to Rebecca Barick. Maybe we'll get Jupiter back. Rebecca, you're in the council meeting. Welcome to the council meeting.
Yes.
Please
Hello.
Please state your
I
name.
am Rebecca Barrick.
Yes.
Sorry. I'm Rebecca Barrick. I live at 1222 Leander Drive here in Norfolk, Virginia. And God, I haven't spoken to the council since the Hershey bar. I'm glad to see that Ms. Johnson seems to be feeling better. I know we were all very concerned when she wasn't able to make the meeting, so I'm glad she's feeling better now. And I think the main question is, does the police department belong to the people or doesn't it? If the police department belongs to the people, then the answer is that the people have to decide if what's supposed to be their public servants are serving them properly. And without the raw data, we are not able to make that decision. Without a civilian review board with the ability to subpoena and the ability to decide consequences, not merely recommend consequences, but decide consequences, then our ability to be in charge of our own city and of our own police department is curtailed. That is why we need to release the raw data, all historical raw data, so that the citizens can decide what this means and whether or not we're being properly served. And I know that the police department is trying to fight this. They're saying, well, let's hand it off to academics to aggregate it and mix it, match it, wait, this way and that. But the fact of the matter is, there are plenty of people who have that capability. If the raw data were released, we have no shortage of people in this city who can help make sense of those numbers. We have no shortage of people who have the skills and have the ability. And in addition, all disciplinary reports must be made public, because right now we have a situation where cops may do whatever, and whatever the consequence is, we never find out what they did or what the consequence was. We can't even decide if the consequence was just. And throughout the country, there have been a lot of cases of basically a paid vacation in exchange for murder, which needs to be ended. And speaking as one of the people who were camped out in front of your lawn, thank you so much for your hospitality. But the fact of the matter is, this fight is not over simply because there was an Occupy, and we will have to consider what our options are for continuing the protest if satisfaction is not gained in this meeting or in future meetings. I'm not making any threats of any sort. I'm simply saying that we came to fight for this either in council chambers on WebEx or through our right to protest, our First Amendment right to protest, and we are more than comfortable continuing to pursue
Thank you very much.
those avenues.
Next, we're going to call Abigail Atkinson. Hello, Abigail. This is Kenny Alexander. You're in the council meeting. Welcome to the meeting. Please state your name, your address, and you have 3 minutes to address the council on R15.
Thank you. My name is Abigail Atchison. I live at 1126 Buckingham Avenue. I'm here to urge City Council to put power back in the hands of civilians by firstly dictating the manner of release of use of force records that the NPD has committed to, and also by creating a civilian review board with real power to monitor police activities and prevent abuse of power. As I said, although NPD has already stated publicly it will release use of force records, City Council should demand that NPD do so in a manner that maximizes usefulness to the people of the city, meaning the records have to be released promptly and in the order of most to least recent, and also records that document the more extreme uses of force by police officers should be released prior to reports that concern minor uses of force. I also second earlier comments, I forget who said them, about how weak and poorly thought out this ordinance is. I really do think a civilian oversight board has to have subpoena power. It has to represent individuals from all wards. It should have multiple members from public housing facilities that are disproportionately targeted by police and most heavily policed. And it must have the ability to decide the consequences for violating officers. I also second things said earlier about the board being entirely civilian. No police officers or former police officers should be on this board under any circumstances. And also I echo earlier sentiments about funding for this board being actually taken from the existing Norfolk Police Department budget and not additional funds being given to the NPD.
Thank you. Next, we have Robert Williams.
Hello?
Hello, Bob. Kenny Alexander. You're in the council meeting. Welcome to the city council meeting. You're speaking on RF-15. Please state your name, your address, and you have 3 minutes to address the council.
Thank you. Robert Williams, 500 Bob T. Alexander. You're in the council meeting. I'd like to get an echo.
Bob, try. Can you hear us?
Okay. This echo.
Can you turn your, do you have your computer on or up?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go right on.
Okay, thank you, and I welcome. Thank you guys for holding it, and I'm trying to do this in 3 minutes. It's really gonna be difficult, but you know, I listened to your the 4 o'clock session, and I was thinking that the process is like almost designated. You know, it could be done a little better because you know it's like you're gonna vote on like what we hear now. We've already heard your discussion, but anyway, what I was thinking when I heard the whole issue about how the chief was putting it, and he said like, said like it was like a layman. The layman wouldn't understand. And I'm, what in the world? What do you think we are? We're not laymen, you know, about everything. I mean, like it doesn't take all day to recognize sunshine. Is what my grandma used to say. So I thought the chief had a win-win opportunity, you know, because given the climate of the country. And I thought he had a good opportunity to do what he needed to do, even if it was a bad report about the use of force. Even if there was a bad report about the use of force, the chief had the opportunity to say, well, we're going to do better enough. We're going to do better enough. I mean, nobody's going to say, well, like, you know, now that we like having transparency, might not have the things that came before you, that you can do better. So we wouldn't have had them. I mean, you know, and for the record, like Councilwoman, you know, Williams Graves, I'm an excuse of Admiral Man. I mean, you know, I ain't got no. And I want you guys, sometimes I want you guys to take the moment and say, like, look, when we criticize or whatever, we disagree with whatever you do, it's not personal. You know, we just love our city. We want to have a better city. So that's fine. But look, back to the order. City manager said there needs to be a high level of. Okay. It's like numbers can be aggregated by race, by precinct. You know, it's I think it was like R15 section 1. But look, no, he said numbers are suggested. No, we're not that stupid. We're not that stupid to think that numbers are suggested. Numbers don't lie, but I've always thought numbers don't lie. You know, people do. But you can't, as a city manager, you can't say numbers are suggested. Who do you think you're talking to? We are citizens. We are intelligent. We're not going to misinterpret no numbers that you might think we're going to misinterpret. Mr. Dr. City Manager. And that's something else, but got to move on. So less is less. You know, less is more is what people always say. Less is more, but in this case, less is less. the numbers that we don't get about what the police are doing is fine. Less is less. We just want to know what the police are doing for use of force. I don't understand why that is even an issue in the climate of the country that we're living in. It's ridiculous, Norfolk. You guys should be ashamed of yourself. All of you. Don't support releasing the use of.
Thank you very much. Okay, calling Miss Hegde.
And while we're waiting, we did have 3 emails sent, Mr. Mayor. Carl Jones, Bruce Tingle, and Jennifer Dunleavy about the police use of force issue as well. They wanted to go into the record.
I am busy.
Long distance code.
Busy.
5 seconds.
It would work. This is it.
All right. Dr. Fowler, do you want to clarify this just in the beginning?
Okay. I can do it.
All right, so, Ms. Aurelia, we're gonna move on. Thank you, Denise. I've got my instructions to move on from this. Dr. Fowler, before I call the vote, do you want to make a comment or just report?
I think we're good, sir. We can call the vote.
Dismiss with the charter requirement for reading the ordinance twice and adopt with the effective date. Mrs. Doyle?
I vote aye, but I just wanted to clarify, what we basically have done with this resolution is that it doesn't establish the citizen panel right now. It authorizes the city manager to bring the concept back to council. So I just wanted to make that clear to folks, but again, I vote aye.
Thank you. Mrs. Graves?
I vote aye. I just hope that in establishing the review board, that a lot of the comments we heard were redundant, and that is the sentiment of most of the people with regard to having a citizen review board that is not influenced by the police, and that has a good cross-section of everyday citizens who are encountering or who have encountered the police, so that we can get a real handle on what is happening. And I also want to go on record for supporting that incident reports regarding police be made public on the city's open data portal. I have stated that in an email to the city manager's office, but I do believe that incident reports regarding complaints against police officers and those outcomes should be made public. But I vote aye. Thank you.
Mrs. Johnson?
I'm gonna vote aye, but I also want the citizens to clearly understand that we do hear you. We take into consideration your ideas, suggestions, and recommendations. And I would like to say, please continue that open dialogue between the citizens as well as with the city of Norfolk. Aye.
Thank you. Mrs. McClellan?
First, I would encourage anybody who might be watching this portion of our meeting to also look at our work session, because we had a pretty robust dialogue there that I think it's important to understand, that it's not just here that we've been talking about this. Like my colleagues, I support a citizen review panel that provides independent oversight, and I am encouraged that we are moving in that direction. The other thing that I would encourage people to do is to get in touch with their General Assembly members. Their senators and delegates are going to be going into a special session sometime in August. And there's legislation that our mayor knows very well the process that will influence what we're doing at the municipal level too. So please pay attention at the state level in addition to what's happening in the city of Norfolk. And I vote aye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Riddick.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to vote no because going back 5 years doesn't do us justice. But we went back 20 years, we'd see some of the most senseless and atrocious deaths by the police department. I vote no.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Smeagol?
Just a question on the 5-year. Is the reason because we already have gotten rid of the records from 5 years ago? Is that why we can only go back 5 years?
You got it.
I do not know how long we maintain these records. I don't know.
So the requirement is 5 years.
Requirement of whom?
The requirement of the localities is to maintain records for 5 years, right, for the previous 5 years.
But we
That doesn't
haven't.
mean we may not have them. It just means that the requirement is 5 years. So we know for sure we have the previous 5 years.
So,
And Mr. Mayor and Councilwoman McClellan, I'm assuming that your committee is also going to be looking into some of these issues even further on the citizen board. So I'm expecting that there'll be more guidance that will come out to us after a complete citizen board is also going to look into some of these recommendations. Is that correct?
as it relates to, race equity, income disparities, housing, education, wealth,
Some police issues.
some more criminal justice issues, administration of justice. But
Okay,
I do see some overlap.
Okay.
To answer your
Aye.
question.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye.
Mayor Alexander.
Yes.
I'll just make one comment. The point I was making with my comment, obviously I still vote aye. I certainly endorse and support a citizen advisory council. I said that in my comments earlier, like Andrea commented that we had a good discussion about it at our 4 o'clock. I simply wanted the public to understand what we're voting on tonight. It's not authorization of tonight. That's to come later. So I'm just simply trying to be clear about what's tonight and what's to come. But I support the citizen advisory panel as well, and my vote remains aye. I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is the beginning of the public safety, transparency, and accountability, as well as acknowledging that this council is endorsing a citizen oversight or review commission or committee made up of citizens over public safety. And so we're in an infancy. This is the beginning that this council is taking a bold move, acknowledging that we want to go in this direction. So tonight's presentation by Dr. Feiler is just acknowledging that the council and the manager are putting forth the very beginning, the very structure of what we will add layers to. So I don't want anyone to think that this is the be all. This is just the first, attempt at this. And and so Dr. Fowler, I would yield to you for any closing comments on this before we move on to our 16 and 17.
Sir, I think
That was the
as we said, we've got a lot of work to do, right? So this is just the beginning. So as of this vote now being the majority voting in favor of this ordinance, I now have until September 22nd to sit down with a lot of different individuals and figure out what an effective review panel looks like. That I agree with all the comments that were made by the various individuals. It has to have teeth. It has to have some way of directing and guiding the way public safety looks in the city of Norfolk, and that's where we're headed. And I look forward to bringing that back to you on September 22nd.
Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Mayor and Council, I have a couple of additional items. One is a letter from the city auditor appointing Timothy Haycock to the position of Assistant City Auditor 2 effective August 3rd, 2020, to serve at the pleasure of the city auditor. The motion is to receive and file. Mrs. Doyle?
Aye.
Mrs. Graves?
Aye.
Mrs. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan?
Aye.
Mr. Riddick?
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
Dr. Alexander?
Aye.
And lastly, sir, I have a resolution establishing the Mayor's Commission on Social Equity and Economic Opportunity. The adopt the resolution. Mrs. Doyle,
Aye.
Mrs. Graves,
I'm voting aye for this, but I also would hope that council would consider the resolution that I put forward that has racism as a public health crisis in the city of Norfolk. I know also in the upcoming General Assembly session that the Legislative Black Caucus is posing something very similar for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so I think it provides a great framework for what has happened and what has led us to this point, and especially with the commission that the mayor has put forward, I would really hope that my council members would consider that. We have had resolutions brought to us at 3 minutes before council, and we voted on them. So I vote aye. Thank you.
thank you. Mrs. Johnson,
Aye.
Mrs. McClellan,
Councilwoman Graves, I agree and support that resolution of systemic racism as a public health issue. It's been adopted in many metropolitan cities all over the United States, and I do believe that we should, in the future, near future, bring that back, and I support that. And Mr. Mayor, I'm looking forward to working with you on this commission. It's an honor, and I look forward to our first meeting in September. Thank you. Aye.
Mr. Riddick,
Aye.
Mr. Smeagol,
Aye.
Mr. Thomas,
Aye.
Dr. Alexander.
Aye.
That's all I have, sir.
All right, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you.